It sits under a gray sky, with the engine ticking, the smell of warm oil and wet grass drifting across a quiet training field. The year is the early 1960s. A group of conscripts, boys with cropped hair and nervous smiles, stand in a neat line while an instructor in a faded greatcoat taps the steel with his knuckles. He calls it simply the T-34. He does not call it old. He does not call it a relic. To him, it is a tool that still starts on the first crank when the weather cooperates, still soils hands with grease, still makes sense. The hull wears the accumulated fingerprints of 3 decades. Factory rivet lines and hurried welds, cut marks from field repairs, shallow scars along the glacis where fragments once struck and bounced. The paint has been renewed and renewed again. Spring green layered over a wartime drab, stenciled training numbers where unit emblems used to be. The tank's tracks chew a narrow oval into the dirt as the engine warms. For a moment, it could be any day between 1941 and the present. For a moment, time folds. Our story is not about a museum exhibit lifted by a crane and set forever on a plinth. It is about a working vehicle that fought during the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, was recovered and rebuilt, and then kept serving, first in the Red Army's post-war ranks, later as a training machine, until the 1960s. The exact identity of such a tank is not a single celebrated serial number carved into marble. It is instead a thread woven through records of repair echelons, depot logs, and photographs from ranges and motor pools. Parts were swapped, assemblies were replaced, hulls endured, disappeared into workshops, and returned with new life. In this sense, the story of one T-34 is both a single line and many, a narrow path and a well-trodden road. To understand how a tank could live that long, we begin on the steppe, where the air smells of crushed wheat and cordite. The Kursk salient, summer 1943. Fields scarred by trenches and mine belts, river crossings camouflaged with brush, villages turned into strong points. Soviet forces dug in for months, layering defenses in depth, anti-tank ditches, gun lines, and fallback positions, waiting for the German offensive that finally came in early July. In the south, near Prokhorovka, armor poured into a few kilometers of rolling ground on July 12. Machine guns stitched the wheat. Shells lifted the earth in great sheets. Through it all, the T-34, then predominantly the T-34-76 variant with the F-34 76.2 mm gun, moved forward and back, firing on the run, losing tanks to direct hits, mines, breakdowns, and the simple exhaustion of men and metal. A striking feature of the Eastern Front was not just the number of tanks committed, but the speed at which damaged vehicles returned to the line. Soviet doctrine and practice evolved under pressure. By 1943, frontline repair echelons had become highly organized. Light repairs occurred near the battlefield. Tracks, road wheels, radiators, fuel lines, valve adjustments. Medium repairs took place farther back. Engine swaps, transmission work, hull welding. Deep overhauls were shipped by rail to major depots and factories that had relocated east earlier in the war. The Soviet system treated the tank not as an indivisible artifact, but as a collection of assemblies, engine groups, radiators, clutches, gearboxes, turret components. Anything that could be unbolted could be replaced. This is where our long-lived T-34's life splits and continues. It could have been hit at Kursk, sidelined by a penetrator that cracked but did not kill the hull, or immobilized by a mine that sheared a bogie and blew off track links. It could have baked a final drive on a hot afternoon and been abandoned until nightfall. In any of those cases, recovery teams, armored tractors, tankers towing tankers, crews with steel cables and profanity would have hauled it to the nearest collection point. From there, if judged repairable, it was tagged, documented, and moved rearward. The journey might end at a regional tank repair base staffed by metal workers who knew exactly how to stitch a fractured armor plate and how to line up a replacement V2 diesel so the clutch did not chatter. The Soviet V2 engine, a 12-cylinder, 38.8-liter aluminum diesel, gave the T-34 its characteristic tone and endurance. A properly maintained V2 could run hundreds of hours between major services, and frontline refurbishments often treated engines as interchangeable hearts. If one failed, another took its place, sometimes drawn from a cannibalized hull, new from a plant hundreds of kilometers away. Transmissions were likewise swapped, as were final drives. The turret of a T-34-76 seldom changed type mid-war, but interior fittings, optics, and radios were updated when possible. The cumulative effect was paradoxical. A single hull could remain itself, while many of its organs were replaced. When the fighting around Kursk tapered into a broader Soviet offensive, many damaged T-34s returned to service. And some of those, like the survivor we follow, continued to fight through the latter half of 1943 and into 1944. By then, however, the T-34 family itself was shifting. The T-34-85, introduced in early 1944, fielded an 85mm gun and a new three-man turret with a larger ring. A T-34-76 hull could not be upgunned to a T-34-85. The turret ring diameter and structural differences made such a conversion impractical in the field. That means any T-34-76 that lived onward did so as a T-34-76, gaining modifications and repairs but not transforming into the newer type. Many did, and they continued to serve in roles suited to their capabilities. The war ended with the Red Army possessing tens of thousands of tanks, self-propelled guns, and specialized vehicles. Demobilization did not mean discarding all of them. The Soviet armed forces classified equipment into active units, second-line formations, and training establishments. Tanks considered obsolete in frontline combat still had value for driver instruction, gunnery practice at reduced charges, and technical schooling. Equipment was mothballed, rotated, and in many cases issued to training centers affiliated with DOSAAF, the mass voluntary society that prepared citizens for military service, including vehicle operations. Our Kursk veteran, by now a patched and proven T-34-76, entered this post-war world. It may have served briefly in a line unit during the late 1940s when T-34-85 production continued and newer designs like the T-44 and T-54 began to appear. But its destiny was training. Records from Soviet motorized training regiments and civilian defense clubs show T-34 vehicles, particularly the 85 variant, active well into the 1950s and early 1960s. The older 76s were fewer, but they existed in depots and schools, running circuits, grinding down tracks, teaching clutches and gears to a generation that had not known wartime. Tanks were expensive. Steel had to earn its keep. Once assigned to a training establishment, the work of survival changed. Wartime crews had listened for the pitch of a whining final drive or the dull thud of a thrown track while under fire. Peacetime instructors listened for them in the rhythm of a classroom day. Engines were run on schedule. Planed metal shavings in the oil pan signaled a coming overhaul. Students learned to grease every nipple on a bogey arm, to tension a track by half turns, to keep dust out of the air filters and raw fuel out of the crankcase. If a tank was temperamental, it could be coaxed by men who knew its name and quirks. How long to let the glow plugs sit before a winter start. How to double-clutch second gear so it wouldn't bark. There were other paths for old T-34s, too. Some became engineering tractors, stripped of turrets and fitted with winches. Others served as recovery vehicles on airfields or as moving targets on ranges. Dangerous work, surprisingly, because even a blank-loaded practice round can do real damage to a welded seam. Some ended their lives as monuments, tanks in the towns they had defended. Others were scrapped, their steel returning as rebar or pipe. The one we follow avoided both the plinth and the melt. It stayed in power. What does it mean to say such a machine fought for 20 years? The phrase tempts us to imagine continuous combat from 1943 to the 1960s, which is not what happened. After 1945, the Soviet Union did not deploy T-34-76 tanks in major battles of its own. But the vehicle's active service life, counted as years during which it remained on the roster, fueled, maintained, and operated, stretched into a second decade and beyond. In that time, the tank continued to fight in a different way. It fought inertia and obsolescence by being useful. It trained crews who would later serve on T-54s and T-55s. It taught habits of maintenance and discipline that outlived it. It carried history not as a narrative, but as a sound, the thunk of a hatch, the chuff of a diesel at idle, the hard rattle of track on packed earth. If we look for names, we find people rather than a single chassis number. There were the wartime drivers, often the youngest members of their crews, whose hands learned the weight of the clutch and the bite point that made a T-34 feel either nimble or stubborn. Some commanders kept a pencil in their breast pocket and a map under their thigh, who stood halfway out of the hatch in July and relied on their gunner's instinct more than on pristine optics. Some mechanics made a Xerox of knowledge across years. How to listen, how to align, how to avoid breaking bolts that wouldn't break in the first place if you were gentle. After the war, some instructors treated an old tank as a patient. Their students marveled that the steel under them had once rushed through smoke where the air tasted of burned wheat. There is a photograph from a training ground in the late 1950s. A T-34 on a dirt circuit. The turret at 12 o'clock. The commander crouched just below the rim of the hatch. The tank is too clean for combat, but not clean enough for inspection. One can see the factory casting marks on the turret cheek, raised letters that speak of a foundry long relocated and yet still working. The tracks are worn smooth along the guide horns where they kiss the wheels. Dust curls behind the tank, hanging in the air like old stories. Is it our tank? The caption does not say. The record is indifferent to our desire for a single protagonist. But it says something else. The T-34 was still there, still active, 2 decades after the day a crew climbed aboard and faced an enemy across a wheat field. There are facts we can state plainly. The Battle of Kursk began in July 1943, with its most iconic armored clash near Prokhorovka on July 12. The T-34-76 was the predominant Soviet medium tank in that phase, equipped with the 76.2 mm F-34 gun, and powered by the V-2 diesel. Soviet repair and recovery systems, by mid-war, were capable of returning large numbers of damaged tanks to service within days or weeks, depending on severity. The T-34-85 variant entered production in early 1944 and served with the Red Army through the end of the war and afterward. Post-war, T-34s, especially T-34-85s, remained in Soviet service as training and second-line vehicles into the 1950s and 1960s. Civilian defense organizations and military schools continued to operate T-34s during that time. Some were converted to auxiliary roles. Others were preserved as monuments. There are also facts we mark as uncertain. The precise, continuous chain of custody for a specific T-34-76 hull from Kursk to a 1960s training ground is difficult to document end-to-end in public records. Wartime and post-war documentation exists, but it is fragmented and focused on units and aggregates rather than individual vehicle biographies. Depot logs track incoming and outgoing numbers. Workshop reports note the count of engines replaced. Railway manifests list flat cars loaded with tanks repaired. A single hull might receive a new turret, a new engine, or even a new hull section welded in place after a mine blast. At what point does identity end? The law says the frame number matters. A crew would say, it's the tank that stops being stubborn when you double-clutch into third. For a historian, a chain of verifiable details outlines the path, even if the line isn't unbroken. We know how many T-34s fought in a given unit during a given operation. We know how many were knocked out, how many were recoverable, and how many were restored. We know which training units used T-34s after the war, in what numbers, and until roughly when. We know the system that made these things possible, a vast network of workshops, depots, and schools that handled steel the way a nation handles memory, imperfectly but persistently. Return to that 1960s morning. The instructor climbs aboard. He is older than the students and younger than the tank. He shouts the start procedure over the wind. Battery on. Fuel cock. Throttle set. Starter. The diesel coughs. Coughs again. Catches with a loping rhythm that becomes smooth when the first cylinder warms and the others follow. The tank shudders like a horse that remembers what to do when a boot touches its flank. The instructor checks gauges. Oil pressure steady. Water temperature rising. Ammeter positive. He is not thinking of a battle in 1943. He is thinking of the next corner, the next downshift, the next lesson that will prevent a thrown track and an afternoon wasted in the sun. If steel can carry a story, then the T-34 is both heroic and workmanlike. It is a story of design choices, sloped armor that broadened survivability margins, wide tracks that floated on mud and snow, a diesel that traded high RPM for endurance, a layout that punished crews with a cramped turret but rewarded them with reliability. It is a story of logistics, in which the ability to fix and return a tank mattered as much as building it in the first place. It is a story of people who learned to drive by feel and to trust a machine that spoke to them in vibrations and smells. And it is a story of time. 20 years in steel is a lifetime in doctrine. When the T-34 first entered combat, the Soviet Union fought for survival and space. 20 years later, new tanks rolled down parade routes with smooth armor and stabilized guns, and the world had changed in ways the crews of 1943 could not have imagined. Yet here, on this small patch of ground, the past still moved. The tank from Kursk, repaired, re-engined, repainted, still taught new hands where the bite point was, still insisted on a firm push to unstick the left brake, still filled the air with the sweet, sharp scent of warm diesel and dust. In the afternoon, the students take their turns. The first one stalls it. The instructor bangs the hatch and laughs. The second finds second gear with a clunk that won't be so loud the next time. The third is careful, too careful, riding the clutch until the smell warns him and he lets it out. The tank circles, the grass flattens. The track marks deepen into a rut that will be there when the rain comes tonight. The sun slides along the turret's curved cheek and catches the old casting marks again, the ones that tie this steel to factories moved east in 1941 and 1942, to workers who slept in workshops and ate near their machines, to a country that made tanks the way some nations make legends. When the day ends, the tank is backed into the shed. The engine ticks as it cools. A drip pan slides under the final drive. Habit, not necessity. Someone notes the fuel used, the hours run. Someone else closes the logbook, a small, unglamorous act that nonetheless builds the bridge any historian must walk. On its spine is a date that is now long ago. On its pages are numbers and remarks that, put together with other numbers and other remarks, allow us to say with confidence, a T-34 that fought at Kursk could be, and often was, repaired, reassigned, and kept in working, official service until the 1960s. This is not a miracle story. It is an industrial one, a logistical one, a human one. The tank itself has no memory. It will not tell you what it saw. But every nick and weld records a decision someone made: recover, repair, return. For a machine built for a single desperate moment in history, that is a kind of dignity. The last thing the instructor does is lay his hand flat on the armor, right where the heat still radiates. He switches off the light and closes the door. For 20 years, across winter starts and summer dust, across battle and peacetime instruction, the T-34 has done what it was asked to do. Tomorrow, if the weather holds, it will do it again.